15 years after losing his sister, a child he'd never met drew her secret hiding place by hand. And when he followed the lines, what he found turned memory into reality. Adrian Vale stepped out of the glass doors of Vale Industries, the late afternoon sun glinting off the mirrored building behind him. The courtyard was mostly empty, except for the hum of traffic in the distance, and the muted trickle of water from the fountain. He had just finished a long meeting with investors, the kind that left him restless, his mind still spinning with numbers and projections. As he crossed the courtyard toward his car, something caught his attention. Near the far corner, where the concrete met the small strip of garden, a little girl sat on the ground, her knees bent, her small hands moving steadily over the pavement. She had a box of colored chalk beside her, the sticks worn down from use. The picture spreading out before her was no child's idle scribble. It was deliberate, each line drawn with care, arrows pointing in specific directions, strange symbols scattered across the shapes. At the end of the path she had drawn was a small house, marked with a bright yellow star. Adrian slowed his pace, curiosity tugging at him. Children rarely wandered onto this property, especially with security stationed at every entrance. He glanced toward the guard at the gate, but the man was watching the street, unaware of the girl's presence. She didn't look up when Adrian stopped a few feet away, her dark hair falling over her face as she filled in a crooked fence beside the star-marked house. "That's quite a map you're making," he said, his voice gentle but edged with curiosity. The girl glanced at him briefly, her brown eyes sharp and assessing in a way that didn't match her age. Then she returned to her drawing, dragging a piece of white chalk along the pavement to create a winding path. "Is it for a game?" he asked. She shook her head without looking at him. "It's not a game." Adrian crouched down so he could see the picture more closely. The path twisted through shapes that looked like buildings, and the symbols seemed to mark specific places, though he didn't recognize them. "What's at the star?" he asked. The girl paused, pressing the chalk against the pavement until it broke. She picked up another piece before answering. "It's where she is." Something in her tone made him stop. "Who?" She looked up at him then, and her voice was steady when she said, "Your sister." The words landed like a stone in his chest. His sister, Clara Vale, had been missing for 15 years. No one outside his family and the police had known the details, and the few photos that existed had long since faded from the public eye. He studied the girl, trying to understand. "How do you know about my sister?" The girl stood, brushing chalk dust from her hands. She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped back and looked down at the map as if checking her work. "Follow it," she said simply, and then she picked up her chalk box and walked away, leaving him staring at the star on the pavement, his heart beating faster than it had in years. Adrian felt the air shift around him, the sound of the fountain fading into the background as the little girl's words sank in. "Your sister." He straightened slowly, unsure if he had heard her correctly, his mind immediately pushing back against the possibility. It had been 15 years since Clara vanished, 15 years of unanswered questions and false leads, of long nights staring at old photographs, wondering if she was still alive. No one outside the police and his closest family knew the private details of her disappearance, and certainly not a child he had never seen before. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost careful. The girl, small and thin in a faded blue dress, didn't flinch under his gaze. She met his eyes with the steady seriousness of someone much older. "It's where she is," she repeated, pointing at the star she had drawn on the chalk map. He took a slow breath, searching for a logical explanation. Maybe she had overheard something. Maybe someone was playing a cruel joke through her, but her tone was too calm for make-believe. "Who told you this?" She shrugged, her fingers tightening around the piece of chalk. "She did." Adrian's pulse quickened. "She told you?" The girl nodded. "She said I shouldn't tell anyone, but you're not anyone. You're her brother." He studied her face, looking for signs of a lie, but found only the unblinking honesty of a child who believed every word she spoke. "What's your name?" "Ella," she said simply. "Ella," he repeated, trying to ground himself. "How do you know my sister?" Ella glanced around the courtyard, as if checking for someone, then leaned a little closer. "I met her at the old house with the crooked fence. She told me she couldn't leave yet. She said if I wanted to help her, I had to draw you a map." A flicker of memory tightened his chest. When they were children, Clara had once described her dream house, a small white home with a fence that leaned to the left, wild flowers growing in the cracks. It wasn't something anyone else could have known, not unless they had been there with her. Adrian fought to keep his voice even. "Where is this house?" Ella pointed at the chalk path again, tracing the winding lines with her fingertip. "Follow the map." It's all there. He wanted to demand more details, to press her until she explained everything. But the determination in her eyes told him she had already said as much as she intended for now. She picked up her box of chalk, tucked it under her arm, and took a step back. "I have to go," she said. "Ella, wait," Adrian called, but she was already walking away, her small figure disappearing past the fountain. He stood there, staring at the crude drawing on the pavement, the yellow star burning in his mind. For the first time in years, the possibility that his sister might still be alive felt real, and it terrified him almost as much as it gave him hope. Adrian stayed in the courtyard long after Ella had gone, the chalk map at his feet like an unsolved riddle he couldn't stop staring at. His first instinct was to dismiss it. Children imagined things all the time, and his sister's disappearance had been the subject of whispers for years. Maybe Ella had overheard a fragment of gossip from an adult, or stumbled on a story online. But as he crouched to study the lines and symbols she had drawn, his certainty began to fray. The crooked fence was what caught him first. It wasn't just any fence, it leaned at a sharp angle, one post shorter than the rest, just like Clara had once written about in the worn leather journal she kept as a teenager. He could still remember the entry, her looping handwriting describing the perfect little house she hoped to own one day, with a crooked fence that gave it character and made it look like it had stood for 100 years. That journal had been in his possession since the week she vanished, and he had never shown it to anyone. Then there were the red shutters. Bright, bold, and just a little chipped around the edges, Clara had painted them herself in the journal's sketches. She'd told him when they were kids that red shutters made a house look alive, even in the winter. He had never forgotten that, but it was not something any news article or police report had mentioned. He found himself tracing the path on the pavement with his eyes, noting how Ella had drawn narrow alleys, a small bridge, even a patch of trees clustered together in an uneven triangle. It was too specific to be random, and the way she had drawn it, with clear intent, not the careless lines of a bored child, made his chest tighten. Still, doubt fought for space in his mind. There were 1,000 ways someone could fake a story, and Adrian had learned the hard way how people could exploit grief for their own purposes. Over the years, strangers had claimed to have seen Clara, to have spoken to her, even to have hidden her. Every lead ended in disappointment, each one leaving him more guarded, less willing to believe. But Ella was different. She hadn't asked for money or attention. She hadn't even stayed long enough for him to ask all the questions. She'd simply given him the map and walked away, as if the rest was up to him. Adrian straightened and looked around the courtyard, his eyes catching on the security cameras mounted on the building. He made a mental note to review the footage, to see where she had come from, and how she had gotten past security without anyone noticing. As he finally turned toward his car, the image of the yellow star at the end of the map stayed with him. He told himself it was probably nothing, just another false lead. But somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice whispered that this time felt different, and that ignoring it might be the biggest mistake of his life. Adrian didn't waste time once he was back in his office. The chalk map still played in his mind like a loop he couldn't pause, each crooked line and bright yellow star etched into his memory. He pressed the intercom and told his assistant to send in Marcus Hale, his head of security. Marcus had been with him for nearly a decade, a man who valued facts over theories and who never asked unnecessary questions. If anyone could quietly find out the truth about Ella, it was him. When Marcus stepped inside, Adrian closed the door and lowered his voice. He explained what had happened in the courtyard, keeping his words careful, detached, though inside he felt anything but detached. He described the little girl, her name, and the map she had drawn, avoiding mention of the personal details that had unsettled him most. Marcus listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, then nodded once. "I'll handle it," he said simply. Adrian leaned back in his chair, watching the man leave, and tried to focus on the reports scattered across his desk. But every time he glanced at the numbers, he saw the red shutters in his mind, the crooked fence, and the steady gaze of the child who had spoken about his sister as if she had just seen her. By late afternoon, Marcus returned, carrying a slim file. He placed it on the desk and stood back, waiting for Adrian to open it. "Her name is Ella Harper," Marcus began. 7 years old. Lives in a foster home on Whitmore Street, about 2 blocks from here. No known family connection to you or the Vale family. She's been there for just over a year, after her last placement didn't work out. Teachers describe her as quiet, observant, and bright. No history of lying, troublemaking, or seeking attention. In fact, she tends to avoid the spotlight. Adrian flipped through the file, finding a school photo of Ella. She was looking slightly away from the camera, her dark hair falling across one cheek, her eyes focused on something beyond the frame. It was the same sharp, assessing look he had seen in person, the kind of look that belonged to someone who noticed everything but spoke only when necessary. "She's never been in trouble?" Adrian asked, still scanning the pages. Marcus shook his head. "Not once. If anything, the report suggests she's more responsible than most kids her age, keeps to herself. The foster mother says Ella spends a lot of time outside, drawing with chalk or exploring the neighborhood. No pattern of making up stories, no sign she's being coached." Adrian closed the file and set it on the desk. The facts left him with more questions than answers. There was no obvious reason Ella should know anything about Clara, yet she had drawn a map with details that had never been public. He felt the familiar pull of hope and caution battling inside him. "Keep this quiet," he told Marcus. "No one outside this room needs to know about her." "Not yet." Marcus nodded once, understanding without needing further explanation. Adrian watched him go, the silence of the office pressing in. Somewhere nearby, 2 streets away, was a little girl who might hold the key to the mystery that had haunted him for half his life. And for the first time in years, he didn't know whether to be afraid of the truth or desperate to find it. The next morning, Adrian found himself standing on the cracked front step of a weathered 2-story house on Whitmore Street. The foster home looked tired but cared for, its white paint peeling in places, and a small garden of potted plants lined along the porch. He had called ahead under the pretense of wanting to speak with Ella about her chalk drawings for a community project. The foster mother, a woman named Mrs. Kent, had been polite but wary, agreeing to a short visit. Mrs. Kent greeted him at the door, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She was in her late 50s, with warm eyes and a no-nonsense air. Adrian explained again that he wanted to speak with Ella privately. After a moment's hesitation, she stepped aside and called into the house. Ella appeared at the top of the stairs, her hair pulled into a messy braid, wearing a faded sweater several sizes too big. She looked at Adrian with the same careful gaze as before, studying him as though measuring what he might do with what she gave him. She came down slowly, her small hand sliding along the railing, and stopped a few feet away. "Hi, Ella," Adrian said gently. "Do you remember me from yesterday?" She nodded, but didn't smile. "You're the man from the building." "I am," he said, lowering his voice so Mrs. Kent couldn't hear. "I've been thinking about the map you drew. I wanted to ask if you could show me where it leads." Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in defiance, but in thought. She glanced toward the kitchen where Mrs. Kent was pretending not to listen, then back at him. "Why?" "Because I think it might be important," he said honestly. "It might help me find someone I've been looking for a long time." She hesitated, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "You have to promise me something first." "What's that?" "You can't tell the bad man," she said, her voice so soft he almost didn't hear it. Adrian felt a slow chill move through him. "Who's the bad man, Ella?" Her lips pressed together, and she shook her head. "If I tell you, he'll know I told. You just have to promise." He studied her for a moment, sensing that pushing too hard would shut her down completely. "All right," he said finally. "I promise I won't tell him." She seemed to weigh his answer, her eyes fixed on his face as if trying to detect any lie. After a moment, she gave a small nod. "Okay, I'll show you." Mrs. Kent looked up sharply when Ella announced she was going out for a walk, but Adrian assured her they would stay close and be back soon. Outside, Ella led the way down the street, her stride brisk for someone with such short legs. She didn't speak, and Adrian didn't press her, letting her guide him while the unease settled deeper into his chest. Whoever the bad man was, Ella believed he was real, and that meant this was no longer just about a chalk drawing. It was about something dangerous. The morning air was cool as Adrian followed Ella down a narrow side street that soon gave way to quieter roads. She walked with purpose, glancing over her shoulder every so often as if to make sure they weren't being followed. Her small sneakers made soft, scuffing sounds on the pavement, and she kept her hands stuffed in the pockets of her oversized sweater. Adrian stayed a few steps behind, letting her lead, memorizing every turn they took. They moved past rows of small houses with peeling paint and sagging porches, the kind of neighborhood where time seemed to move slower and everything bore the weight of years. A dog barked from behind a chain-link fence, its voice sharp in the otherwise still morning. Ella didn't flinch, just kept moving, turning into an alley that smelled faintly of damp leaves and rust. The path matched the chalk map in his mind. He recognized the narrow stretch between buildings she had drawn, the small bridge over a stream so shallow it barely moved, and the cluster of trees shaped like the uneven triangle she had marked in green. The precision unsettled him. This wasn't a child's guesswork. She had been here before, more than once. They crossed into the outskirts of the city, where the sidewalks cracked and weeds pushed through the gaps. The houses were farther apart now, some boarded up, others with curtains drawn tight. Adrian felt a low hum of unease building in his chest. He had been in dangerous neighborhoods before, but never on the trail of something this personal. Ella slowed as they reached the corner of a street lined with abandoned properties. She pointed ahead without speaking. Adrian's gaze followed her gesture, and his breath caught. There it was. The crooked fence leaned exactly as she had drawn it, one post shorter than the others, the wood weathered gray by years of wind and rain. Beyond it stood a small house with peeling white paint and shuttered windows. Even from here, he could see the shutters were red, though the color had faded and chipped with time. His sister's dream house, the one she had described in her journal so vividly, stood before him in silent ruin. They approached slowly. The yard was overgrown, the grass tall and wild, scattered with broken branches. The gate hung half open, creaking softly when Ella pushed it with her hand. Adrian's shoes crunched on the gravel path as they walked toward the front porch. The place felt empty, yet not abandoned in the way some houses did. The air seemed to hold a faint trace of recent life, as though someone had been here not long ago. Adrian's eyes scanned the windows, the shadows, looking for movement. Ella stopped at the bottom step. "This is it," she said quietly. Adrian stared at the door, his pulse loud in his ears. He didn't know if stepping inside would bring him closer to the truth or to something far worse. But the crooked fence and red shutters left no room for doubt. This was exactly where the map had meant to lead them. Adrian pushed the front door gently, half expecting it to be locked, but it swung open with a slow groan. The air inside was thick and stale, carrying the scent of dust, mold, and something faintly metallic. The light from outside filtered in weakly through the shutters, casting dim stripes across the floor. He stepped inside cautiously, his shoes creaking on the warped wooden boards, while Ella followed close behind, her small figure barely making a sound. The living room was sparse, just a few pieces of mismatched furniture coated in a thin layer of dust. A couch with sagging cushions sat against the far wall, and beside it, an old lamp leaned slightly, its shade tilted. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and a draft whispered through the gaps in the shuttered windows. It had the feeling of a place abandoned years ago, yet Adrian's instincts told him to look closer. He moved through each room on the ground floor, noting the worn rugs, the peeling wallpaper, and the faint scent of smoke near the kitchen. Ella stayed at his side, pointing occasionally to small details, a cup on the counter, a chair pushed away from the table, that looked too recent to belong to an empty house. In the hallway, they found a door leading down to the basement. It was shut tight, the paint around the handle chipped from years of use. Adrian tried it and found it locked. He stepped back, scanning the nearby shelves until he spotted an old key hanging from a bent nail. It took some effort to turn the stiff lock, but finally, the latch gave way, and the door opened with a reluctant creak. A cool, damp air rose up from the basement, carrying with it the earthy scent of concrete and mildew. Adrian flicked on a flashlight from his pocket, the beam cutting through the gloom as they descended the narrow steps. The sound of their footsteps echoed softly, and with each step, the air grew colder. At the bottom, the flashlight swept across the space, and Adrian froze. Against the far wall was a small makeshift bed, a folded blanket lying neatly on top. Nearby, a crumpled paper bag spilled fast food wrappers, the grease stains still fresh. A half-empty bottle of water sat on the floor beside it, condensation still visible on the plastic. Someone had been here recently, very recently. Then his light landed on something that made his chest tighten. Taped to the bare concrete wall was an old photograph, yellowed at the edges but unmistakable. Clara. His sister's face stared back at him from years ago, smiling in the sunlight, her hair pulled back, wearing the same necklace she had the day she disappeared. Ella stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "I told you she was here." Adrian reached out, his fingers brushing the photo as if touching it might make the years between them disappear. The air in the basement felt heavier now, charged with the knowledge that Clara had been here, and that whoever had been living in this house had kept her memory close. It was proof that she was not just a ghost from his past, she was still part of his present, and maybe, just maybe, still alive. Adrian kept his eyes on the photograph, his mind spinning through every possible explanation. The air in the basement felt colder now, the kind of cold that didn't just touch the skin but sank deeper. He turned slowly to face Ella, who was standing near the makeshift bed, her gaze fixed on the floor as if she had been caught in something she had hoped to keep hidden. "Ella," he said quietly, "you've been here before, haven't you?" She hesitated, her small fingers twisting the hem of her sweater. "Yes," she whispered. "How many times?" She lifted her head just enough to meet his eyes, her expression cautious. "A lot. Since summer." Adrian straightened, his heart tightening. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" "Because she told me not to," Ella said, her voice still soft but steady. "She said it wasn't safe. She said there were people looking for her, and if they found her, they might find me too." Adrian stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Who is she?" "The lady with the scar," Ella replied. "She has a long one here." Ella touched her cheek, running her finger from just below her eye to the corner of her mouth. "She hides it most of the time with her hair, but sometimes when she forgets, you can see it." His pulse quickened. "What's her name?" "She told me to call her Anna," Ella said, and Adrian froze. Anna was Clara's middle name, something she rarely used but had always liked. Hearing it now, in this basement filled with traces of someone hiding, made his chest tighten. "What did she say to you?" he asked carefully. Ella's eyes grew distant, as if she were pulling the memories from a place she had kept locked away. "She asked me about the neighborhood, about the people who lived nearby. She gave me sandwiches sometimes, or cookies, and once she gave me a little book with drawings of flowers. She told me I was smart, and that I noticed things other people didn't. But she always said I couldn't tell anyone I saw her." "Did she ever say why she was hiding?" Ella shook her head. "Only that she was waiting. She said she couldn't leave until she knew it was safe. She was scared of a man, but she didn't say his name. She just called him the bad man." Adrian felt a heaviness settle over him. If Anna was Clara, then she was alive, and had been living just 2 streets away from his office without him knowing. But the fact that she was hiding meant something was still threatening her, something dangerous enough to keep her underground for years. "Ella," he said, kneeling so he was at her eye level, "thank you for telling me. You did the right thing." Her eyes searched his face, as if testing his promise. "You won't tell the bad man?" "No," Adrian said firmly. "I won't." Ella gave a small nod, the first flicker of trust breaking through her guarded expression. In that moment, Adrian knew she had given him more than information. She had given him a way to find his sister, and maybe a way to bring her home. The next morning, Adrian arrived at the foster home just after sunrise, a black SUV idling at the curb with 2 of his most trusted security men inside. Ella was waiting on the porch, her sweater sleeves pulled over her hands, her face serious. She didn't ask questions when he motioned for her to follow him into the car. The ride to the house was quiet. The only sound the low hum of the engine and the faint tapping of her shoes against the floorboard. Adrian had spent most of the night going over possibilities in his head. If the woman Ella called Anna was really Clara, he needed to move quickly before she vanished again. He had instructed his team to be ready to bring her somewhere safe, somewhere no one could reach her. His chest felt tight with the thought that in just a few hours he might finally see his sister again after 15 years. When they reached the crooked fence, the morning light revealed more of the house than he'd noticed before. The warped boards, the faded shutters, the rusted hinges on the gate. He motioned for his men to circle around back while he and Ella went through the front. The door opened without resistance, but the moment they stepped inside, Adrian felt the change. The air was colder, emptier. The faint traces of life he had noticed yesterday were gone. The couch in the living room was bare of its dust-coated blanket. The chipped mug on the kitchen counter was missing. Even the smell was different. Less like someone had been living there, more like a place left untouched for years. They moved through the rooms quickly, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the stillness. The basement door stood ajar. Adrian's stomach sank as he descended the stairs, Ella right behind him. The beam of his flashlight swept across the concrete, landing on the space where the makeshift bed had been. It was empty. The blanket was gone, the food wrappers cleared away, the water bottle removed. Even the photograph of Clara had been taken from the wall, leaving only a faint square of cleaner concrete where it had hung. "Someone cleaned it out," one of the security men said from behind them, his voice low. Adrian stared at the empty space, his mind racing. Whoever had been here had left in a hurry, but not so hurriedly that they hadn't taken everything with them. They had erased every sign of themselves, as if they had never been there at all. Then Ella tugged on his sleeve. "Look," she whispered, pointing to the far corner of the floor. There, faint but visible against the dusty concrete, was a drawing in pale blue and yellow chalk. It was the map again, almost identical to the one she had made in the courtyard, but this time the lines were sharper, the arrows more precise, and the star even brighter. Adrian crouched to study it, his throat tight. This wasn't a message left by accident. It was a signal, a trail. She had left it for them to find. Clara, or Anna, was on the move, but she still wanted to be found. Adrian didn't leave the property until he had every detail documented. His security team photographed the chalk map, the basement, the crooked fence, every corner of the house that might hold a clue. Ella stayed close, watching with a seriousness that seemed far too heavy for someone her age. When they were done, he took her back to the foster home and promised to keep her updated. She didn't ask questions, just nodded, as if she understood the importance of what they had found and the danger that came with it. Back at his office, Adrian closed the door and pulled up the property records on his secure terminal. It took only minutes to see the first red flag. The house wasn't owned by an individual. It was listed under a company called Brantford Holdings, registered in another state. That company had no website, no public records of employees, and no active business activity. On paper, it existed only to own properties. He dug deeper, tracing the company's tax filings and shell registrations, and found 3 other properties tied to the same corporate name. All of them were in remote or rundown areas, the kind of places that could hide someone easily. One was a warehouse on the edge of the industrial district, another a boarded-up apartment building near the docks, and the third, a small motel just off the highway. The pattern was too deliberate to be a coincidence. Adrian called Marcus, his head of security, and told him to run a background check on Brantford Holdings. Within an hour, Marcus returned with a name: Victor Hale. The name made Adrian's blood run cold. He remembered reading about Hale in investigative reports over the years, though he had never dealt with him directly. Victor Hale was the kind of man who didn't just skirt the law, he built his life on breaking it. He had been tied to human trafficking, fraud, extortion, and several disappearances that had never been solved. None of the charges had ever stuck, thanks to his network of lawyers, and the fear he inspired in anyone who might testify against him. Adrian stared at the file, each line of text making the pieces fall into place. If Clara had been hiding in that house, she hadn't just been avoiding the public, she had been hiding from Hale. The scar Ella described, the secrecy, the insistence that no one could know she was there, it all made sense now. Clara had been running from someone dangerous, someone with the resources to find her if she made a single mistake. He felt a wave of anger push through the cold weight in his chest. For 15 years he had wondered why his sister never reached out, never sent a message. Now he understood. If Hale had been involved in her disappearance, or if she had crossed paths with him in some way, contacting Adrian might have put him in danger too. Adrian leaned back in his chair, his mind already moving toward the next step. Finding Clara meant going straight into Hale's territory. It would be dangerous, but the thought of walking away had never once crossed his mind. He finally knew who the enemy was, and that meant the game had changed. Adrian sat across from Ella at the long wooden table in the quiet room he used for private meetings. A notepad lay between them, but he let her speak first, not wanting to crowd her thoughts. She sat with her legs tucked under the chair, her hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate, and began recalling things she had noticed during her visits to the house. She spoke slowly, choosing her words carefully, as though each detail mattered. "She had this cup," Ella said, tracing a circle on the table with her finger. It was white with little blue flowers, but one of the flowers was smudged, like someone had tried to paint over a chip. She drank tea from it every time I saw her. Adrian wrote it down, his mind already considering how a chipped teacup could help them. "Anything else?" "She hummed a song sometimes," Ella continued, her voice soft. "I don't know the name, but it was slow, kind of sad. It sounded like the music they play in old movies when someone's leaving on a train." Marcus, standing nearby, tapped something into his phone. "That might be a clue," he said quietly. "If it's an old standard, we can run it through audio recognition databases. If she's been in any public place with music playing and a surveillance mic caught her humming, it might pop up." Adrian glanced at Ella. "Did you ever see her go anywhere else?" Ella thought for a moment. "Once, she left with a man who had a beard and a red truck. She told me she had to go check on the safe place. When she came back, she had groceries and a bag from a motel. The key card was hanging from her pocket, and it had a picture of a pine tree on it." That was enough for Marcus to start working. Within hours, his team identified 3 motels within a 50-mile radius that used key cards with pine trees. One of them was in a rural town far from the main roads, the kind of place where strangers were noticed, but not questioned. Adrian insisted on going with the team. They arrived at the motel in the late afternoon and set up in an unmarked van across the street. The place was small, only 10 rooms lined in a row, their paint faded from years of sun. A neon sign buzzed faintly above the office. For hours, they watched the comings and goings. It was just past 11 at night when the door of room 6 opened, and a woman stepped out. She wore a dark jacket and kept her head down, moving with a noticeable limp. Even from a distance, Adrian felt his breath catch. The curve of her shoulders, the way she paused to scan the parking lot before moving, all of it pulled at something deep inside him. Marcus raised the camera, zooming in. The image that appeared on the screen was grainy, but unmistakable. It was her. Or at least it was someone who looked so much like Clara that Adrian's heart ached with the recognition. She climbed into the passenger seat of a red truck, and just like that, she was gone into the night. Adrian returned to the motel the next night with Marcus and 2 other men he trusted completely. They parked the van in the same spot across the street. The windows darkened, the engine off. The air outside was heavy with the smell of rain, and the neon sign above the motel office flickered like it was struggling to stay alive. Adrian sat forward in his seat, eyes fixed on room 6, the one where he had seen the woman with the limp. Hours passed in slow, measured silence. The occasional car pulled into the lot, its headlights sweeping over the cracked asphalt before disappearing into one of the narrow spaces. Most stayed only minutes, a quick exchange at a door before driving away. The world here seemed to run on transactions no one spoke about out loud. It was close to midnight when the door to room 6 opened. Adrian's breath caught. The woman stepped out into the damp night air, pulling the hood of her jacket low over her face. Even from a distance, he saw the same careful scan of her surroundings, the same way she paused before moving. That limp was still there, subtle but undeniable. Adrian's hand moved to the door handle, ready to get out and cross the street. Marcus put a hand on his arm. "Wait," he murmured. Adrian frowned, but then he saw it. 2 black SUVs pulling into the lot from opposite ends, their windows tinted, their movements too synchronized to be coincidence. The vehicles stopped in a way that boxed in the red truck parked near the woman's room. 4 men got out, all wearing dark jackets despite the mild weather. Even from here, Adrian recognized the kind of posture that came from years of working for someone dangerous. Their eyes scanned the lot, sharp and deliberate. One of them spoke into a small device clipped to his jacket. Victor's men. Adrian felt his pulse quicken. If they made their move now in front of her, she might panic. Worse, she might think Adrian was with them. That would be enough to send her running again, disappearing into whatever hiding places she had left. He had already waited 15 years. He couldn't risk driving her deeper into the shadows. The woman with the limp seemed to notice the men. Her head turned slightly, and for a second, Adrian thought she might freeze. But instead, she adjusted her hood and moved toward the office as if she had business there. The men didn't approach her yet, just spread out enough to keep her in their line of sight. Marcus's voice was low but firm. "We pull back. If they think we're watching her, they'll change the plan. We need to stay invisible." Reluctantly, Adrian leaned back, forcing himself to let go of the door handle. The van eased away from the curb, the motel shrinking in the side mirror. Through the glass, he caught one last glimpse of the woman disappearing inside the office, the men still circling like sharks. Every instinct in him screamed to act now, but he knew Marcus was right. This wasn't the moment to take her. The wrong move could cost him the only chance he had to bring her home. Adrian had barely settled into his study when his phone rang. The number flashing on the screen was unfamiliar, but the voice on the other end was one he recognized immediately. Mrs. Kent, Ella's foster mother. Her words came fast, her tone tight with fear. "Mr. Vale, it's Ella. She's gone." Adrian was on his feet before she finished. "What do you mean gone?" "She was in her room after dinner. I went to check on her 20 minutes ago and she wasn't there. The window's open, the screen's on the floor. I've looked everywhere and I called the police, but—" Her voice cracked. "You don't think she just ran off, do you?" "Number." Adrian didn't think that for a second. His mind jumped instantly to the men at the motel, to Victor Hale and his reputation for tying up loose ends. If they suspected Ella had led Adrian to the house, they would see her as a threat, even if she was just a child. "Lock your doors," he told Mrs. Kent. "Stay inside. I'm sending someone to you now." He hung up and called Marcus, pacing the length of the room. "Ella's missing." I think Hale's men took her. Marcus didn't waste time asking for proof. On it, he said, his voice already sharp with urgency. We'll track the area cameras and run her phone location. If they grabbed her, we'll find their route. Adrian grabbed his coat and keys, his thoughts moving in rapid bursts. Ella had been the one to give him the map, to speak Clara's name, to risk telling him about the house. She had known she was in danger. Her warning about the bad man made that clear. And yet she had trusted him enough to help. Now that trust might have put her directly in Victor Hale's path. He tried not to picture her small frame surrounded by men like the ones from the motel. Tried not to imagine the fear in her eyes if she realized she was being taken somewhere she couldn't get away from. She was smart, yes, but she was only 7. And Hale's people were ruthless. Marcus called back 20 minutes later. Traffic cams picked up a dark van leaving Whitmore Street around the time she went missing. No plates visible. It turned off onto the service road leading toward the highway. Adrian's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Where does that road lead? Several places, Marcus replied, including a warehouse Hale's used before. Adrian's chest burned with anger. Clara had hidden from Hale for years, and now the one person who might lead him to her was in his hands. He wouldn't let that stand. Get a team to the warehouse, Adrian ordered. No mistakes. We bring her out alive. As he sped through the dark streets, the city lights blurring past, one thought stayed with him. He had already lost his sister once. He would not lose Ella, too. Whatever it took, whatever risks he had to face, he was going to bring her back. Adrian knew Victor Hale well enough to understand that brute force alone would not work. Men like Hale didn't just guard themselves with guns and locked doors. They guarded themselves with fear, with the kind of paranoia that made them suspicious of everything except the scent of profit. Greed was his weakness, and Adrian intended to use it. In the early hours of the morning, Adrian sat with Marcus and 2 other trusted operatives in his private office, the blinds drawn, the table littered with maps, photographs, and hastily written notes. If we go straight for him, we risk walking into a wall of men, Marcus said, leaning over the table. We need him distracted, somewhere he thinks is worth leaving his safe spot for. Adrian tapped a location circled in red on the map, an abandoned warehouse on the south side of the city. We leak a story through one of my old business contacts, someone Hale believes is crooked enough to be useful. Make it sound like I'm desperate to unload one of my companies in a quiet, off-the-books buyout. High payout, quick transfer, and no questions asked. Marcus frowned. He'll smell a setup. Not if we make it look like I'm the one on the run, Adrian replied. We feed him a narrative. Vale's spooked. Vale's bleeding cash. Vale's trying to sell assets before the feds close in. Hale's ego won't let him pass up the chance to humiliate me and get richer in the process. They spent the next 2 hours crafting the bait. An encrypted message was sent to a known associate of Hale's, laced with just enough insider language to make it believable. The numbers were big, the window of opportunity tight. By dawn, Adrian's contact had confirmed the message was in motion. Meanwhile, Marcus's team combed through surveillance footage and tapped into a network of informants who owed Adrian favors. It was one of those favors that finally paid off. A truck matching the one seen at the rural motel was spotted entering a gated property far outside the city, a place no one had linked to Hale before. The timing had to be perfect. They needed Hale to take the bait and move toward the warehouse, pulling some of his men with him, leaving the real hideout exposed. By mid-afternoon, confirmation came through. Hale had taken the hook. His convoy was on the road, headed toward the south side. Adrian felt a flicker of grim satisfaction. Good. While he's chasing a ghost, we go for the real prize. The SUV convoy rolled out quietly, keeping to back roads. Marcus gave last-minute instructions to the team, making sure every man knew his role. The plan was simple but dangerous. breach fast, secure Ella, and get out before Hale realized he had been tricked. As the countryside blurred past the windows, Adrian's thoughts sharpened into focus. This wasn't just about beating Hale at his own game. This was about bringing Ella home safe and cutting off the reach of a man who had already taken too much from him. Hale had been hunting for years. Tonight, the hunt would end. The convoy approached the gated property under the cover of darkness, headlights off until the last possible moment. The air was damp and heavy, the silence broken only by the low hum of engines. Marcus gave the signal, and the team moved quickly, cutting through the chain on the gate before slipping inside. Adrian stepped out, his pulse pounding, every step pulling him closer to the moment he had been chasing for 15 years. They moved through the main building like shadows, each man taking his position with practiced precision. The hallways smelled faintly of oil and dust, the kind of scent that clung to old warehouses and forgotten storage facilities. Somewhere inside this place was Ella, and if Marcus's informant was right, Clara. Adrian gripped the flashlight in one hand, the other steady on the small pistol he carried, ready for whatever they might find. The first locked door they came to had fresh scuff marks near the handle, signs it had been opened and closed often. Marcus crouched down, working the lock with practiced ease. The door swung open to reveal a narrow storage room, and in the far corner, sitting on the floor with her knees pulled tight to her chest, was Ella. Her eyes widened when she saw Adrian, then she scrambled up and ran into his arms. "You came!" she whispered, her voice shaky but steady enough to break the tension coiled inside him. He crouched down, checking her quickly for injuries, finding nothing more than a bruise on her arm. "I told you I would," he said, his voice low but certain. "You're safe now." One of the men took her gently by the hand, leading her toward the exit. Adrian wanted to watch her leave, to make sure she was completely out of danger, but Marcus motioned toward another door at the end of the hall. "There's someone else," he said quietly. Adrian's chest tightened. He followed Marcus down the hall, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness until it landed on the second door. Marcus opened it slowly, and inside was a small, dimly lit room. On a narrow bed against the wall sat a woman, her back to them. "Clara?" Adrian's voice caught in his throat. The woman turned her head slowly, and in the soft light, he saw the curve of her face, the familiar lines that had aged but not disappeared. A thin scar ran from her cheekbone to her jaw, and her eyes, though tired, were unmistakable. She blinked at him as if she couldn't quite believe he was real. "It's me," he said, stepping forward. She stood on unsteady legs, her hands trembling. "Adrian?" Her voice was rough, but the sound of it hit him like a wave. "It's me," he repeated, and in the next moment she collapsed against him, her weight almost nothing in his arms. He held her tightly, feeling the years of absence, of searching, of unanswered questions dissolve into the reality that she was here, alive and breathing. After 15 years, he had found his sister, and this time he wasn't letting her go. Adrian didn't let go of Clara for a long moment, afraid that if he loosened his hold, she might vanish again like she had all those years ago. When he finally stepped back, she was unsteady, so he guided her to the narrow bed. Her hands were cold, her face pale, but there was a stubborn light in her eyes that told him the years hadn't broken her completely. Marcus slipped out, giving them the space they needed, leaving only the quiet hum of the building around them. "You're alive," Adrian said, still trying to take in the truth. "All this time I thought—" He stopped, not wanting to finish the thought. "I know," Clara said softly. "I wanted to reach out to you, but I couldn't." If I had, it would have put you in danger. Victor doesn't just punish the people he has a problem with, he punishes the people they love. Adrian leaned forward, searching her face. You were hiding from him? She nodded. 15 years ago, I saw something I shouldn't have. A meeting, a deal being made. I wasn't supposed to be there. Victor saw me, and he told me what would happen if I ever spoke about it. I ran. I thought I was clever, moving from place to place, changing my name, keeping my head down. But I knew if I came back into your life, he'd find you, and he'd use you to get to me. The weight of her words settled heavily on him. All the years of silence, all the birthdays and holidays without her, suddenly had a reason that made terrible sense. You could have trusted me, he said quietly, though he knew she had acted out of fear for him. Her eyes filled with tears. I did trust you. That's why I stayed away. I couldn't stand the thought of you ending up like the others who crossed him. Adrian's voice was low but firm. You don't have to hide anymore. She shook her head, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. I almost believed I could just keep disappearing forever. Then I met Ella. Adrian's chest tightened at the name. You knew her? I found her one afternoon near the old house with the crooked fence, Clara said. She was drawing on the sidewalk, all alone. I gave her a sandwich, and we talked. She reminded me of myself when I was little, quiet, but watching everything. I told her stories, never saying who I really was. I didn't think she'd put the pieces together. But she noticed things. She's sharper than most adults I've met. She's the reason I'm here, Adrian said. She drew me a map. Clara let out a quiet, almost disbelieving laugh. I never thought she'd lead you to me. I thought I was protecting you by staying hidden, but maybe she knew better. Adrian reached for her hand, holding it firmly. It's over now. You're coming home. For the first time in years, she didn't look over her shoulder. She just nodded. Victor Hale's arrest came at dawn, the culmination of weeks of evidence gathering and quiet coordination with federal agents. Adrian had handed over everything, records of the shell companies, witness accounts, and the data Marcus's team had uncovered about Hale's trafficking and fraud operations. When the raid came, it was swift and decisive. Hale was taken from one of his properties in handcuffs, his expression still defiant but edged with disbelief. By the end of the week, his network had been dismantled, his most loyal men in custody, his assets frozen. For the first time in years, Adrian felt the shadow that had loomed over his family begin to lift. Ella was placed in Adrian's care on a temporary basis, while the foster system reviewed the circumstances. She didn't say much when she first arrived at his penthouse, carrying her small backpack with everything she owned. He noticed she kept it close, as if ready to leave at a moment's notice. Adrian didn't push. He gave her space, just as he gave Clara space, letting them both settle into the safety they had not known in too long. Clara stayed in the guest suite across the hall from Adrian's. She was still thin, her movements sometimes tentative, as she adjusted to being free from hiding. There were moments when she would drift into silence, staring out at the city lights as if they were something she was trying to remember. But there were also moments when she would tell stories about their childhood, about places she had hidden, about the kindness of strangers who had helped her. Her voice grew steadier with each day, the scar on her cheek a reminder of what she had endured, but no longer a mark that defined her. The first shared meal was quiet. Adrian ordered simple pasta and fresh bread, figuring it was hard to go wrong. Ella sat at one end of the table, Clara at the other, and he in the middle, the space between them feeling larger than it was. But then Ella mentioned the crooked fence at the old house, and Clara smiled, saying she had once thought about painting it blue. Adrian added that blue wouldn't have matched the red shutters, and to his surprise, both of them laughed, softly at first, then with a warmth that filled the room more than the food or the candlelight. Evenings became their time. Sometimes they would eat together. Sometimes they would watch old movies on the couch. Ella curled up with a blanket while Clara leaned against the armrest, her eyes focused, but her mind, Adrian knew, still piecing itself back together. He found himself listening more than he spoke, learning the small details that made them who they were now, not just who they had been. There were still hurdles ahead: court hearings, therapy sessions, and the slow work of building trust. But there was also something new forming between them, something steady and real. As Adrian looked at his sister and the little girl who had brought her back into his life, he realized that family could be built in more ways than one. They were proof of it, sitting together at his table, finding their way forward. The morning light spilled across Adrian's office, warming the polished wood of his desk and the deep leather of the chairs. The space had always been a place for business, contracts, negotiations, numbers, but lately it had taken on a different weight. It was quieter now, not because work had slowed, but because his life outside these walls had changed. On the wall behind his desk hung a new edition, framed in glass and surrounded by a simple dark border. It wasn't a piece of expensive art or a rare photograph. It was Ella's chalk map. The colors had faded slightly since that day in the courtyard, the lines softened by the rain and time before he'd managed to preserve it. But the crooked path was still there, the cluster of shapes and arrows, and at the end, the bright yellow star. The star that had led him to the house, and to the truth he had been chasing for 15 years. He had thought long about where to put it. Part of him had considered keeping it at home, near the kitchen table where the three of them now shared most of their meals. But in the end, he decided it belonged here, in the place where he had spent so many years building walls instead of looking for doors. The map was a reminder that not every problem could be solved with strategy and resources alone. Sometimes it took the courage of a small voice, and the trust to listen to it. Clara had stopped by earlier in the week, her recovery visible in the way she carried herself. She still had quiet moments, times when her eyes drifted far away, but she smiled more easily now. She had stood in front of the framed map for a long time, her fingers brushing the edge of the glass. "She brought me back to you," she had said, her voice steady. "She saved both of us." Ella had seen it too. When he showed her the frame for the first time, she had tilted her head, studying it like it was a puzzle. "You kept it?" she asked. "Of course," Adrian told her. "It's the most important thing in this office." She had smiled then, the shy but genuine kind of smile he had come to treasure. Weeks had passed since Victor Hale's arrest, but the changes in their lives still felt new. Ella had started calling the penthouse home without hesitation. Clara had begun talking about the future in terms of plans rather than survival. Adrian found himself looking forward to evenings when they would eat together, sometimes in comfortable silence, sometimes trading stories that made them laugh. Now, as he sat at his desk, his eyes wandered to the map again. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't polished, but it was real. It told a story about finding what was lost, about listening when it mattered, about the way family could come together from the most unexpected places. And every time he looked at that yellow star, he remembered that sometimes the smallest voices carried the clearest truth, and that if you followed them, they might just lead you home. If this story moved you like it moved us, don't forget to give it a like. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe. We'd love to have you with us.